Federation.
Madam President, we wish to thank the briefers for their objective assessments of the catastrophic situation in the Gaza Strip, particularly the direct, frank, and blood-curdling testimony from Mr. Lockyer. What can be added to those words? Can we even bear to hear more? Madam President, today's meeting is taking place against the backdrop of yet another veto exercised by the United States, a veto against the draft resolution of the Security Council for an immediate ceasefire in the Strip. There is no justification for the American delegation for such action. There is no justification. There can be no justification for this. The unprecedented levels of violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict zone has been ongoing for 140 days now. The colossal figures of losses and devastation which we heard about from the briefers today speak for themselves. More than 29,000 people, including women, including children, have fallen victim to the indiscriminate bombardment and Israeli military operations. At least 69,000 people have been wounded and horrific injuries. These are horrific injuries, as we have already heard today. 80% of the entire population of the Strip have now become internally displaced persons, the majority of whom have found refuge in the south of the Strip in the cities of Khan Yunis and Rafah, which are effectively besieged. The Israeli Air Force has been aggressively bombing them. We are effectively talking about a deliberate policy of Western Jerusalem to expel the Palestinians from Gaza, the consequences of which will inevitably result in Gazans breaching the border with Egypt, and the humanitarian disaster will then spill over onto Egypt's soil. These so-called diplomatic efforts of Washington on the ground, which our U.S. colleagues have been so increasingly vocal about, these incantations have thus far had no effect whatsoever. It is clear that real leverage over the Israeli government is something which Washington simply does not have. The Western Jerusalem authorities have been categorically stating that the cleansing of the Strip apparently will continue for more months. They have been issuing calls to continue the military operation to eliminate UNRWA's presence in the Strip and to violently and forcibly displace the Palestinians from their homes. At the same time, it is also clear that despite the bravado, Israel has been failing to achieve its stated objectives. The Israeli military operation, judging by open source information, has not helped and will not help to release the hostages. Against this backdrop, the statement by the U.S. representative about a ceasefire not being able to take place without the release of hostages seems doubly cynical. This release of hostages cannot take place without a ceasefire. So what we are observing is the impasse of unbridled escalation, where thousands upon thousands of Palestinians are becoming victimized. At the Security Council, there's an effective consensus about the need to end this violence. The path to multilateral efforts under the aegis of the United Nations is blocked merely by one delegation, that is the United States of America. By shielding its Middle East ally, the U.S. is attempting to sell as an alternative solution to sell the Security Council's blessing for a solution which is advantageous to Israel alone, or more precisely, advantageous for the United States geopolitical agenda in the Middle East. All United Nations structures, led by Secretary General Guterres, have been unanimously stating that there's a need for an urgent humanitarian ceasefire as the prerequisite for the establishment of humanitarian assistance at the necessary level and the establishment of conditions for the release of hostages. This specific demand to the parties was the cornerstone of the draft resolution authored by the delegation of Algeria, which the United States vetoed. Colleagues, by blocking Security Council resolutions time after time and arrogantly calling on the Security Council not to interfere with your diplomacy, you are doing yourselves a disservice instead of allowing the Council to leverage the resources at its disposal to exercise its authority. You are increasingly losing control over the situation. You are giving the green light for the continuation of the aggression against the Palestinian people, including for the conduct of the ground operation in Rafah. The impasse at the Security Council, which was spawned by the persistent, obdurate position of the United States, has resulted in the fact that violence in Gaza has already spilled over to the entire Middle East region. We are observing the consequences and fallout in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. Empathy for the Palestinian people has naturally been roused throughout the entire Middle East, and yet Western countries, instead of seeking an adequate political solution, have been attempting, as is their custom, to bomb the dissenters and those who do not agree with their policies. The use of force by the Anglo-Saxon coalition against the sovereign nations of Syria, Iraq, and Yemen poses a direct threat to international peace and security, undermines the world order rooted in the supremacy of international law and the central role of the United Nations. Madam President, we do not see even a glimmer of a prospect to the end for ending the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, the ongoing military operation by Israel in the Strip and beyond, which gave rise to this. Given the absence of unimpeded humanitarian access to the Strip, particularly in the northern regions there, the Gazans have been suffering from hunger and communicable diseases. Under these catastrophic circumstances, we are appalled, dismayed at the incomprehensible decision of a number of Western donors to suspend financing for UNRWA in connection with suspicions of its employees' participation and cooperation with Hamas. These employees were immediately fired prior to the conduct of any investigation whatsoever, merely on the basis of Israel's accusations. We call for the decision for the suspension of financing for UNRWA to be reconsidered. The collective punishment of millions of Palestinians in need of assistance is simply amoral. It cannot be viewed as anything other than donor blackmail and the politicization of humanitarian issues. For in fact, this means a worsening of the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza, including as a consequence of the disruptions in the delivery of humanitarian assistance, as well as educational and social services, healthcare for approximately 6 million Palestinians on the entire occupied Palestinian territory, as well as in Jordan, in Syria, and in Lebanon. In this connection, we condemn attempts to discredit UNRWA and the pinning of political labels on its operations. For our part, the Russian Federation reaffirms our position in principle. This protracted, decades-long conflict has no military solution. The only way to resolve this conflict is exclusively through political diplomatic means under the two-state formula. We consistently advocate a humanitarian ceasefire as the sine qua non for the delivery of unfettered humanitarian assistance to all people in need and the unconditional release of all hostages. This is an imperative which all of the efforts of the Security Council should be focused on. We urge all to heed the calls of the Arab, Muslim world and the overwhelming majority of the international community who have been demanding for an end to be brought to the suffering of peaceful civilians in Gaza and the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation.